My parents skipped my son's funeral, then demanded his $100,000 trust for my sister's wedding. Before we dive into it, tell me in the comments where you're from. I love seeing the different places people tune in from. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. I never imagined I'd be standing over a tiny casket, picking out flowers for my 7-year-old boy. Eli wasn't supposed to leave this world so soon. He had the kind of smile that lit up a room, the kind of laugh that stuck in your chest even after he was gone. He fought so hard against the rare illness that slowly wore his body down, but no amount of hospital visits or whispered promises at his bedside could stop what was coming. When he passed, a part of me went with him. Planning his funeral felt like torture, but I forced myself to do it because he deserved every ounce of love and dignity I could give him. What I didn't expect was to be doing it alone. I thought family was supposed to hold you up when the world came crashing down, but mine? My parents decided they couldn't make it. They didn't even try. My dad, Carl, called me the night before and said, "It's just too hard, Harper. We don't want to remember him that way." My mom, Denise, added in her quiet, almost rehearsed voice, "We'll light a candle at home." That was it. No arms around me, no tears beside mine, no last goodbye to their grandson. I can't describe the feeling of standing in that church, looking around at empty pews that should have been filled with people who claimed to love him. Friends from Eli's school came, my neighbors came, even old co-workers I hadn't spoken to in years showed up. But my parents, his grandparents, were nowhere in sight. Each time the door creaked open, I prayed it would be them. Each time it wasn't, the bitterness inside me deepened. I tried to tell myself maybe grief broke them in a way I couldn't understand. Maybe they were too fragile to face it. But when you're the one burying your child, fragile isn't an option. You get up, you put one foot in front of the other, and you stand there because love demands it. They chose absence. And that choice told me exactly where I stood in their lives. After the service, when the last person left, and I was staring at the fading flowers and the dirt that now covered my boy, I felt something inside me harden. I wasn't just mourning Eli anymore. I was mourning the parents I thought I had. All the memories of them telling me family comes first felt like a cruel joke. I drove home in silence that day, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wanted to scream, to shatter something, to demand answers. But instead, I sat in my driveway numb. The tears wouldn't come anymore. I realized in that moment that grief had taken my son, but betrayal had stolen my family. And I had no idea that betrayal was only just beginning. After the funeral haze faded, I barely had the strength to keep moving through the motions of daily life. I thought maybe I'd get a few days of quiet, some space to breathe and grieve. Instead, my parents showed up at my house, sitting stiffly in my living room like they had something important to discuss. I expected condolences, maybe even the apology I was still waiting for about their absence at the service. But that's not what they came for. My father leaned forward, voice measured, almost businesslike. "Harper, we need to talk about Eli's trust." At first, I didn't even understand what he was saying. The account was something my late husband's family had established years ago, meant to ensure Eli's future education, his medical care, anything he might have needed. I had barely looked at the paperwork since losing him. To me, that money wasn't numbers in a bank. It was a promise to my child. When I asked what exactly they meant, my mother shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting away before she finally said, "Well, with Eli gone, the question is what happens next. That money should stay in the family." My stomach dropped. And then the blow landed. My sister Lena's wedding was coming up, and they thought the trust should be redirected to cover her costs. I remember staring at them, stunned, words caught in my throat. The house was still filled with reminders of Eli, his shoes by the door, his drawings on the fridge, the silence of his empty bedroom. And here they were, talking about dresses and venues, like the money he'd never touch was suddenly up for grabs. My chest tightened with disbelief. How could they sit there, just days after I laid him to rest, and treat his legacy like a check to be cashed? It felt like my son's memory had been pushed aside, replaced by centerpieces and champagne toasts. I searched their faces, waiting for one of them to backtrack, to say it came out wrong. But all I saw was expectation, as though I should nod and agree it was the practical thing to do. In that moment, grief twisted into something sharper. I wasn't just heartbroken, I was horrified. The people who should have been honoring my child were already thinking about how to benefit from his loss. The trust wasn't theirs to claim, And the fact they could suggest it without hesitation told me everything I needed to know about where their priorities lay. I didn't answer them right then. I couldn't. My mind kept circling back to Eli's name etched on that account, the intention behind it, the love that created it. To think of handing it over for a wedding felt like betraying him all over again. The conversation about Eli's trust didn't end that night. If anything, it was only the beginning of a campaign I never expected my own family to wage against me. Within days, the calls started coming, first from my dad. He spoke with the same detached tone he'd used before, like this was some kind of negotiation instead of a conversation about my son's life. "Harper," he said, "you're being short-sighted. That money was meant to help, and now it can still help, just in a different way." Eli would have wanted it to stay in the family. Hearing his name tossed in like that made my stomach twist. My father wasn't talking about my little boy, not really. He was using him as a bargaining chip, trying to make it sound like I was the one dishonoring Eli by not handing over what was left behind. My mother wasn't much different. She played the guilt card, telling me how heartbreaking it would be for Lena if her special day fell apart. To them, my silence was selfishness. To me, their persistence was a knife in the wound I was already carrying. Then Lena called. Her voice was shaky, but it wasn't the kind of crying that comes from real devastation. It was desperation mixed with entitlement. "Harper, please," she begged between sobs. "The venue is threatening to cancel. Without that money, the wedding is ruined. Do you really want me to walk down the aisle in some courthouse instead?" Each word landed heavy, but what struck me most was what she didn't say. Not once did she mention Eli. Not once did she acknowledge that I had just buried my child. Her world was centered on table linens, photographers, and guest lists, as though my grief was nothing more than an obstacle to her party. The more I listened, the more I realized they weren't mourning with me. They were circling like vultures. Every conversation revolved around numbers, logistics, and how my refusal would make me look like the cold one in the family. I started noticing a pattern. Whenever they said family, it meant Lena. Whenever they said help, it meant taking from what Eli left behind. It was as if he had been erased, replaced by this prize fund they thought was rightfully theirs. At night, I'd sit in Eli's room, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars still stuck to his ceiling, wondering how they could forget him so easily. My heart was raw, every memory of him still fresh and painful, yet to them he seemed like a footnote, a convenient excuse. The calls blurred together until I dreaded the sound of my phone buzzing. It wasn't comfort, it wasn't love, it was pressure. Pressure to cave, to trade my son's memory for their temporary joy. That betrayal cut deeper than silence at the funeral ever could. Losing Eli had left me broken, but realizing my own parents saw his trust as an opportunity left me furious. They wanted money. I wanted my son. And no amount of tears, guilt trips, or manipulations could change the fact that those two things would never be equal. I tried for a little while to keep showing up at family dinners. A part of me hoped that if I sat at the table, shared a meal, maybe we'd find our way back to something that resembled compassion. Instead, every evening turned into a battlefield. My parents no longer asked how I was holding up or whether I was sleeping at all. The only topic they seemed able to circle back to was the account, as though my child's name had been scrubbed away and replaced with a $sign. Carl had a way of bringing it up casually, like he was talking about the weather. He'd spear a piece of meat with his fork and remark, "You know, it would be such a shame for good money to sit there unused when it could give someone in this family a future." His words carried an edge, but the delivery was smooth, practiced, almost rehearsed. Denise would pick up the thread, sighing deeply as though my resistance was causing her personal suffering. "We're not asking for much, Harper. Think about what this means for your sister. Do you really want to be remembered as the reason her life starts off in hardship?" Every sentence felt like a trap. I'd push food around my plate, too nauseated to swallow, and wonder if they even realized how cruel they sounded. Lena, meanwhile, stopped hiding her frustration. One night she threw her napkin down and snapped, "You're selfish, Harper. Spiteful, even. You can't stand to see me happy because you're miserable." Her words hung in the air like smoke, suffocating me. It wasn't grief speaking. It was entitlement, dressed up as wounded innocence. The cruelest moment came when Denise leaned forward, her eyes brimming with a kind of false sincerity. "You already lost Eli," she said softly, as though that gave her the right to twist the knife. "Don't make us lose Lena's happiness, too." My chest tightened, rage and disbelief colliding inside me. To compare my son's death to a wedding budget, It was beyond insensitive. It was monstrous. I left that night with my stomach in knots, my hands trembling on the steering wheel as I drove home. The house felt colder than ever when I walked in, but it was also quieter, safer, free of their endless badgering. I sat in the silence, finally letting the fury rise without holding it back. They weren't going to stop. They weren't going to see what they were doing as wrong. And I realized the only way forward was to draw a line they couldn't cross. So I made my decision. They would not touch a single cent. No pleading, no manipulation, no amount of guilt could pry that trust out of my hands. It belonged to Eli, and to honor him meant protecting it from people who saw it as nothing more than a means to their own joy. That night, for the first time in weeks, my mind was clear. My family had chosen their side, and now I was choosing mine. I finally reached the point where I couldn't let the conversations drag on any longer. Weeks of side comments, veiled accusations, and tearful phone calls had worn me down, but they had also sharpened my resolve. I sat at my kitchen table one evening, the trust paperwork spread out in front of me, and I made the choice that had been forming quietly in my heart all along. I would not let that money be twisted into something shallow. It had been created for Eli, and if he couldn't use it, then it would be turned into something that carried his spirit forward. The next Sunday, I told them to come over because I wanted to settle things once and for all. They arrived together, Carl with that clipped tone of authority he always used when he wanted control, Denise clutching her purse as though she was bracing herself for a fight. Lena followed behind them, arms crossed, eyes already wet like she had rehearsed her outrage. I poured them coffee, sat across the table, and delivered my decision without hesitation. The trust would not go toward a wedding. It would be donated to a children's hospital, and a wing would carry Eli's name. The room erupted. My father's face turned crimson, his voice booming as he slammed his hand on the table. Ungrateful. That's what you are. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? You're spitting in the face of your family. He spat the word family like it was a weapon, as though it excused every cruel choice they had made. Before I could respond, Lena shot to her feet, tears spilling over as her voice rose. You ruined my wedding. Do you even understand that? Everything's gone because of you. Do you hate me that much? Her sobs were loud, dramatic, filling the kitchen like a performance. She wasn't mourning my child, she was mourning her centerpieces and her venue. I sat there quietly at first, letting them vent, letting the words crash over me. Then I pushed my chair back and stood, my hands steady even though my heart was pounding. This conversation is over, I told them. You will not speak about Eli's trust again. And if that's all you care about, then I want nothing more to do with you. Their voices followed me to the door, accusations and insults tumbling over each other. But I didn't look back. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Cutting them off wasn't a choice I made lightly, it was a necessity. They had turned my grief into a transaction, and I refused to let them take one more piece of my son. That night, the silence in my house felt different. Not empty, not heavy, just clean. For the first time since Eli's passing, I knew I had taken a step toward protecting both his memory and myself. And though it meant losing the rest of my family, it also meant I was finally free from their hold. Months slipped by in an odd blur, a mix of quiet nights and the slow rebuilding of my strength. I had kept my word and cut off contact with my parents and sister, which meant I no longer had to endure their endless badgering. For a while, I almost convinced myself they'd finally understood and moved on. But then, during a phone call with my aunt, the truth came out casually, like it was just another piece of gossip. Oh, by the way, she said, Lena went ahead with the wedding after all. It wasn't anything extravagant, but she managed. Her words stung. Not because Lena had married, she was free to do that, but because it drove home the reality that they had all moved forward without me, as though I'd been erased from the picture entirely. There was no invitation tucked in my mailbox, no olive branch extended, not even a half-hearted message. They hadn't wanted me there. A week later, I stumbled across the photos online. A cousin had posted them, tagging everyone with cheerful captions. My eyes locked onto the images. Lena in a white gown that looked simpler than anything she had bragged about months ago, standing under an arch of wilted flowers. The decorations were modest, the guest list clearly pared down, but none of that mattered. What froze me was the sight of my parents. They were standing close to Lena and her new husband, grinning ear to ear, faces glowing with pride. I stared at those pictures far too long, each one cutting deeper. It wasn't the reduced budget that made me ache. It was the joy they wore so easily. That joy had been missing when I needed them most. At Eli's service, they had been absent, hiding behind excuses. Yet here they were, dressed to the nines, raising glasses like the past hadn't happened. As if my son's death, the fights, the screaming matches, all of it had been conveniently wiped away in favor of staged smiles. The betrayal I felt that day was different from the anger I'd carried before. It was quieter, colder, the kind that settles into your bones. I realized I wasn't just excluded. I had been replaced. In their version of family, I no longer existed. They had drawn a line in the sand and made it clear where their loyalties lay. Closing out of the photos, I sat in silence, letting the weight of it sink in. Whatever lingering hope I'd been holding on to, that maybe one day they would recognize what they had done, or feel even an ounce of regret, died right there. Seeing their smiles confirmed what I had tried so hard not to admit. I wasn't part of their story anymore. And in that final, twisted way, they betrayed me one last time. After everything, I knew I couldn't let Eli's trust just sit untouched, gathering dust as a painful reminder of battles with my family. I wanted it to mean something more than the arguments and accusations that had poisoned those months. I wanted it to mean what it was always supposed to mean: hope for children who still had a chance. So I began the process of turning my decision into reality. The hospital downtown had been the place where Eli spent so much of his time, the halls where doctors fought tirelessly to give him comfort, the place where nurses whispered encouragement when I was too tired to keep smiling. It felt right to return something there. I contacted their foundation office, explained the trust, and told them I wanted the donation to create something lasting. They listened carefully, and when they suggested a wing in Eli's name, I knew immediately that was it. The thought of children walking through doors marked with his name filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in so long. Weeks later, the dedication ceremony came together. A plaque had been placed at the entrance, the Eli ward. I stood there with a small group of hospital staff, a handful of close friends, and even some families who would directly benefit from the programs funded by the donation. As I ran my fingers over his name etched in bronze, I felt something shift. For the first time since that terrible day I said goodbye, the crushing weight on my chest eased just enough to let in a breath of peace. Eli's legacy wasn't about money. It was about giving other children chances he never got. Afterward, photos from the event circulated in newsletters and local media. The hospital staff proudly shared the story of how a grieving mother had chosen to honor her son in a way that would help countless others. And as word spread, so did the questions. Relatives who had heard my parents complain about me started asking why Carl and Denise hadn't been there for such a beautiful tribute to their grandson. People wanted to know why the grandparents' names were absent when their grandson's memory was being celebrated so publicly. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had demanded that money for a wedding, but now the world saw what it had become instead: a gift that would outlast any single day of flowers and music. And in their absence, their silence spoke louder than anything they could have said. They weren't just cut out of my choice. They had cut themselves out of his story. Standing outside the hospital after the ceremony, I felt lighter than I had in months. My grief would never disappear, but it no longer sat inside me like a cage. Revenge, I realized, wasn't always about hurting back. Sometimes it was about taking control of what others tried to twist and turning it into something untouchable. Eli's name would live on, not because of them, but in spite of them. It didn't take long for the hospital dedication to ripple through the family grapevine. At first, I only heard bits and pieces: an uncle calling to say how proud he was, a cousin sending me a quiet message about how touched she was by the tribute. But soon enough, I heard the other side too, the whispers that carried my parents' fingerprints all over them. Carl and Denise had begun telling anyone who would listen that I had stolen from the family, that the trust had been meant for everyone, not just Eli. The story twisted with each retelling, until in their version, I wasn't a grieving mother. I was a greedy daughter who betrayed her own blood. The fallout was swift. At Sunday gatherings I no longer attended, debates broke out. Some relatives saw through my parents' lies, pointing out that the money had never belonged to Lena or anyone else. They said the hospital wing was a legacy worth celebrating, one that honored Eli in the only way possible now. Others, though, clung tightly to my parents' narrative. They muttered about how I'd embarrassed the family, how I'd cut them out just to make myself look noble. Those voices grew louder, emboldened by Carl and Denise's constant complaints. Phone calls that used to come weekly stopped. Invitations disappeared. Family group chats went silent. My name no longer mentioned except in hushed tones or bitter sighs. I realized quickly who was willing to stand with me and who had chosen convenience over truth. The division wasn't neat. It split siblings, cousins, even friends of the family. People I had once considered allies turned cold. Some blocked me altogether, their silence harsher than any insult. For a while, the isolation stung more than I cared to admit. I had already lost my child, and now it felt like I was losing the larger family too. Nights grew heavy, the loneliness pressing against me like another form of grief. But within that quiet, something else began to take root. Each day I didn't cave to their version of the story was a reminder that I didn't actually need their approval to keep moving forward. I didn't need the validation of people willing to overlook abandonment and greed. The circle around me grew smaller, but it also grew stronger. The friends who stood by me did so with unwavering loyalty, never questioning my choices or repeating my parents' venom. And deep down, I knew Eli's name shining over the hospital doors meant more than their acceptance ever could. That realization gave me strength. Losing their approval wasn't really a loss at all. It was freedom. The knock came late in the evening, long after I had convinced myself the silence from my family was permanent. When I opened the door, there stood Denise, her posture fragile, her eyes puffy as though she had practiced the performance of sorrow on the drive over. She clutched her handbag like it was the only anchor keeping her upright, and her voice quivered when she asked if we could talk. For a long moment, I simply stared. Months had passed without a single call, not even a message checking if I was breathing. Yet here she was, trembling on my doorstep as if history could be rewritten with a few carefully chosen words. Against every instinct, I let her speak. She stammered about wanting things to feel normal again, about how families shouldn't drift apart. She pleaded for a reconciliation, her voice full of urgency, as if the wound she had carved into me could be sealed over by sheer insistence. I listened, my arms folded tightly against my chest, until the pressure inside me broke loose. My words came out sharp, cold, and unfiltered. "Where were you when I buried my son?" The question sliced through the air, and she froze. Her lips parted, but nothing came out at first. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. When she finally spoke, it was in fragments. She said it had been too much for her and Carl, that the pain was unbearable, that they didn't want their last memories of Eli to be in a coffin. Then she shifted, almost seamlessly, into excuses about Lena, about the pressure of the wedding, about how they hadn't known how else to handle everything at once. Her explanation unraveled into a tangled mess of self-preservation, and I saw with perfect clarity that nothing had changed. This wasn't about grief, it was about justification. I felt the anger rise again, hotter this time. It wasn't the kind that shook my voice or made me tremble. It was steady, unyielding, the kind that came from finally seeing the truth without the fog of hope. Denise wasn't here for me, and she wasn't here for Eli. She was here to soothe her conscience, to patch over her guilt without ever acknowledging the depth of her betrayal. My grip tightened on the door, and I told her firmly that I would not carry her excuses for her. She had chosen absence when I needed presence most, and there was no undoing that choice. Her face crumpled, a mixture of shame and desperation, but I didn't soften. For once, I didn't bend to her emotions. With one final look, I pulled the door shut. The sound of it closing echoed through the house, but instead of dread, I felt something else, a release. It wasn't just about denying her entry into my home. It was about reclaiming my life from the weight of her manipulation. For the first time in months, I stood in my own space, untouched by their demands, completely certain that freedom had finally arrived. When I walked through the hospital doors, I almost lost my breath. Right above me, carved into a shining plaque, were the words the Eli ward. Seeing my son's name in bold letters, not as a memory but as a legacy, made my chest tighten. For months I had been drowning in grief, but in that moment, I finally felt like he was still here with me. I wandered slowly down the hallway, tracing my fingers along the walls. The smell of fresh paint mixed with the faint hum of machines, but what struck me most was the sound. Children laughing, nurses chatting softly, families holding on to hope. I stopped by a playroom where a handful of kids were chasing each other, their little feet tapping against the floor. I could almost picture Eli there, his bright smile lighting up the space. The ache inside me sharpened, but instead of breaking me, it felt like a reminder of why I had done this. I whispered softly, barely above a breath. "They wanted to erase you, but now you'll never be forgotten." My voice trembled, but I meant every word. My parents could twist the story all they wanted, but here was proof. His name would live on, helping children for generations. When I turned to leave, I felt lighter than I had in months. For the first time since losing him, I wasn't walking with only pain. I carried peace with me, a quiet strength I hadn't known I still had. As I stepped outside into the cool air, a small smile spread across my face. This was my revenge, my closure, my gift to my son. They could never take this away from me. Do you think I made the right choice by cutting them off, or should I have given them another chance? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoy stories like mine, subscribe and stay updated.